Hello, everybody. Happy Friday. Welcome to our webinar series, Literacy is Opportunity. My name is Laura Almazara, and I'm on the literacy team here at Amplify. We're so excited to have you here with us today, and Dr. Jan Hasbrouck as well. I just have a few notes to share before we get started. We are recording today's webinar, and we'll send out that recording link for you to rewatch as you'd like. And everyone here with us today will also receive a certificate of attendance via email. If you want to access closed captions, we have a live captioner with us today. So just click on the closed captions button on the bottom tray. Throughout the webinar, if you have any questions, please go ahead and put those in the Q&A and we'll try to get to them at the end. And we also welcome comments in the chat. So to get started, let's find out where everyone is joining us from.
We have a North Carolina, Ohio, Missouri, Alabama.
Already really great representation of the US.
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We know it's a late in the year webinar, so we really appreciate you taking the time.
We have Canadians and someone from Iceland. So that's
wonderful. I have no idea what time it is in Iceland. That is so great. Just a quick note before I pass the mic over to Dr. Hasbrouck. We do have some more webinars scheduled in this series, so if you haven't already signed up for them, please do. Next week, we're hosting a customer panel with Amplify ELA users. And in May, we're hosting sessions about knowledge building in middle school and how important language screening is for literacy foundations. And to find out more about any of those webinars, just visit literacy-is-opportunity-series. And thank you again for joining us, and welcome, Dr. Hasbrouck.
Thank you. I'll go ahead and get us started. Yeah, I want to make sure I'm sharing the right screen here. So the title of my session, Building Confident Readers Through Dyslexia Screening and Instruction. This is some of the information that Laura was sharing with you, and there'll be some repeating of that, I think, at the end as well. So all that's added here is my Twitter handle. If we're not already connected on Twitter, I would love to be able to follow up. We have a little bit less than an hour all together here today. So I personally have found Twitter, the Twitter community anyway that I pay attention to is a bunch of educational geeks, and we love to share resources and continue conversation. So that's maybe an option for us to connect afterward. Some of you may know some of the work that I've done, and I might not be as familiar to others. So when we're going to spend this time talking about dyslexia, I did want to share with you some of my background and credentials, why I feel I have a right to talk to you about dyslexia. And it comes from both the professional and the personal areas. I started off many, many years ago as a reading specialist, and I did that for about 15 years. And then I spent some time as a literacy coach as well. After getting my doctorate at the University of Oregon, I became a professor of educational psychology and had really an interesting opportunity to work in two areas of ed psych. I worked in special education and at risk, and in school psychology. On the personal side, I have a daughter with dyslexia. So I've experienced this both as a professional working with these children, as a reading specialist, as a researcher very interested in the challenges of struggling readers, and as a mom. This is a picture I like to share with my daughter's permission, Lizzie Spinell. This is taken in my backyard here in Seattle, Washington, where I live. I also wanted to share with you that I've written a book about dyslexia, so another resource. We do only have an hour together. From this book, I'm going to be picking some of the ideas. We're going to focus in today on screening assessments particularly, but spending some time on the instruction, the how and the what of effective instruction. So dyslexia, one of those many aspects of the complexity, the more it seems we know about how difficult, or the more we learn about the process of teaching anyone to read, the more we understand how really complex it is. In a different book that I had the pleasure of writing with my colleague Deb Glazer, we talked about reading this way as being a highly complex task that involves many interconnected and codependent linguistic processes that draw upon a variety of skills. And I think there are many ways to discuss this complexity. There have been many people attempting to demonstrate or illustrate this complexity. I think one of my favorite illustrations of the complexity of reading was done by Hollis Scarborough. I think it's many people's, I know it's many people's favorite way of demonstrating the complexity of reading, because it's pretty rare these days that I attend a session on reading at a conference or even read an article or attend a webinar. I don't see Scarborough's rope. So I kind of assume that you're all familiar with this notion, but it is a really nice way of organizing our thinking around reading. The idea that there is a target, that goal that she represents visually as the tightly woven rope, and describes it as skilled reading being the fluent execution and coordination of those two components, word recognition and text comprehension, that she labels over on the left of the diagram, language comprehension, and all those components and the complexity and the underlying skills of all of those components, interdependent and connected components. We also know from researchers, including Mark Seidenberg, about what this process entails. This complexity involves a reader building a new circuit in their brains, linking that visual code represented on Scarborough's rope by the word recognition to the existing neural systems for language represented on Scarborough's rope by the upper part of that, and literally changing brains through our instruction and through practice. A reader has to build physical new connections in their brains to make reading and writing happen. But there's really good news in all this complexity, is that researchers such as Sharon Vaughn and Jack Fletcher, Louisa Moats, and many, many others have concluded now toward the first third or so of the 21st century, some really, really good news that they have concluded that we finally have enough evidence, Vaughn and Fletcher talk about ample evidence, to suggest that educational systems can be organized. We know, any of us who work in educational systems know that they're not always as organized as we would like them to be, but they can be organized so that the vast majority of students, close to 95%, will be reasonably successful readers. Louisa Moats says something similar. In 2020, researchers now estimate that 95% of all children can be taught to read by the end of first grade. And there are many others who have come to this conclusion. But for all of us, so this is really good news. We've taken that incredible complexity and the knowledge, the growing knowledge about how that actually happens in the brain, to conclude this wonderful news that we can get almost all students there, the vast majority. But in the real world, where we all work, we know that this climb up the ladder, this reorganization of the brain, is going to be a different challenge for different students for a variety of reasons. I hope that you are all, along with Scarborough's rope, familiar with this lovely infographic, The Ladder of Reading and Writing. If you are familiar, you may know it's created by Nancy Young, who's Canadian, one of our good friends and colleagues in Canada, that this this infographic has evolved over years. It originally was called the Ladder of Reading, but Nancy, being someone who's very, very committed to being correct as possible in the evolving science of reading, that we really should never be talking about reading without talking about writing at the same time. So she's expanded her infographic and changed a few aspects about it. And if you're not familiar with it, I would definitely suggest you go to her website at nancyyoung.ca to learn more about this infographic. But I'm using it here today just to represent the fact that colored continuum in the middle is representing the fact that there are children in different areas of ease, is the way Nancy refers to it. They're going to have different levels of ease in climbing the ladder, becoming readers or writers. And the students we're talking about today are generally categorized as children being in what Nancy represents as the red area, where learning to read, spell, and write will, for these students, require code-based, explicit, intensive instruction with frequent repetition. And based on her reading of the research, that's approximately 10 to 15% of the population. So we've, along with just learning a lot about reading, we've learned a lot about what dyslexia is. And most definitions do recognize that children with those children we call dyslexic are going to have difficulties with word recognition, both the accuracy and the fluency of word recognition. That is often, almost universally, accompanied by poor spelling. Though the difficulty with word recognition is grounded in the fact that learning to decode is difficult. And for most of these students, it appears that learning to decode is difficult because they have difficulties. Some go as far as saying deficits in the phonological component of language. Some, but certainly not all, our students with dyslexia do struggle with aspects of language, the upper part of Scarborough's rope. Most actually do not, except for one aspect of language, which is the brain's ability to perceive what the individual sounds or phonemes are in words. And that minor, seemingly minor anomaly of the brain causes incredible ripple effects that affect reading and writing and spelling. And many definitions of dyslexia also use the term unexpected, because these children, in all other ways, this basically means that in general, we have no evidence that the brains of our students with dyslexia have any other challenges or difficulties. They have just abilities that are regularly expected, if not extraordinary, but this one area, so it does make it unexpected. And when we think about all the things that every reader needs to learn, it really is the word recognition area that our students with dyslexia struggle with the most. And when we think about dyslexia as educators, and this is a quote from my book, so I put page numbers there. Of course, whether you're coming at this as a parent or you're coming at this as an educator, there is an understandable, urgent wish to figure out what's going on, to diagnose, we could use that word, diagnose dyslexia both quickly and definitively. And we want some test. Give us the test, the one way to do this test that will get us there definitively and quickly. And unfortunately, we don't have a measure. We're still trying to figure it out. A lot of people are now understanding this importance of identifying our students as quickly and early as possible. And thinking about using some kind of universal and early screening. And it is very important. It's important not just to be able to label a child with dyslexia. That's really not the point. That's not what makes it valuable or important. Early screening is important because we can get started with interventions. And the research is very clear with dyslexia. If we start those appropriate interventions as sufficiently early, we can essentially prevent dyslexia from ever being a factor in our students' lives. It's not that we can prevent dyslexia because it is a neurological, brain-based event or aspect of a child's life. They're born with dyslexia. You can't prevent it from happening, but you can prevent it from being a factor in their lives with early and effective interventions. So that's the framework for what I'm going to talk with you about in terms of assessment. My interest in dyslexia assessment is all about getting us to the correct intervention and making sure that those interventions are actually effective. I have little interest or patience actually for assessments that are all about just labeling children. So just to give you that framework for what you're going to hear from me today. Some of you, I hope, as well are familiar with the work of Steve Dykstra. If you spend any time on the Spell Talk listserv, which is a free, it's a listserv. It's a free opportunity for people interested in reading. You can sign up for that and be a member and participate in very wide-ranging and, to me, fascinating discussions about aspects of reading. And Steve is a frequent participant there. He is a clinical psychologist, lives in the US in Wisconsin, and weighs in frequently about his deep understanding about reading, learning to read, the emotional and psychological impacts that has on students, and his interest in dyslexia. And back in 2019, he wrote this on the Spell Talk listserv that early in learning, there really is no reason to separate dyslexic children from other students who struggle in reading for other reasons, because they all need the same thing. So it's the label sometimes that we spend a lot of time worrying about, are they dyslexic or not dyslexic? The growing body of evidence says that we really don't need to worry that much about why they are struggling, because, as Steve says here, the research is quite clear that they need the same thing. They need, depending on the severity of their struggle, the severity of their dyslexia, the level of the robust intervention is what differs, but not what the intervention is, because that's what we should be concerned about, not just who's dyslexic and who is not, but who is struggling to read. So when we think about doing our best with finding students, making sure that our interventions are correct, and making sure our interventions are working, we often turn to three different categories of assessments. Benchmark screening, which in most schools are being done universally. We do some kind of benchmark screening, especially at the early elementary years, with all of our students. And if we're not, we probably should. For students we have some concerns about, we can provide administer, I guess that's the best word, administer some assessments to look diagnostically at their skills, to analyze what's going on. Why are they not at benchmark when we administered those screening assessments? And then once instruction starts, we have another set of assessments we can use that we often refer to as progress monitoring. So the benchmark screening, all students get that. The diagnostic skills and the progress monitoring are differentiated based on the needs of the students. Each of these assessments are designed, or the category of assessments are designed to answer particular questions. So for benchmark screening, we're really wanting to answer who might need help, which of our students are currently struggling or are likely to struggle if we don't do an intervention. Once we've found those students, the next question is really, what help do they need? What are the skills that they're struggling with? And that's what the diagnostic assessments can help us address. The third category, progress monitoring, is once instruction has started, we want to know the answer to this question: is the work working as we're moving along in our instruction? The students are working hard, the teacher is working hard. Is all that work working? So the benchmark screening, the universal, there is now some efforts and some laws in some states, and it may be in other countries as well, mandates not just to screen generally for reading, but to screen specifically for dyslexia. And there are several commercial assessments. Many of these are quite new. In fact, as far as I know, the test of dyslexia is in pre-order right now. It's just been developed. So, and the Shaywitz dyslexia screen and the early bird are also relatively new assessments. And these are just three. There are others as well. However, as much as we, again, want to have the quick and easy answer for what we're trying to accomplish, identifying students with dyslexia, researchers, including Matt Burns, who I hold in very high regard, is looking at the value of those dyslexia screeners. Do they really give us information that's worthy of buying a whole new assessment and engaging and taking the time to do that? He recently, with a lot of colleagues, wrote an article did a study and published this, that said that the districts who are requiring dyslexia screeners for all of their students should instead consider adopting using measures of phoneme awareness, or those that predict phoneme awareness, such as DIBELS. That was the assessment, or DIBELS Next is the assessment they used in their study. But he's saying those assessments are easy, quickly administered, and perhaps more cost efficient than some of these other screeners. And if you read this article, he says they have higher predictability of dyslexia than the one that they used in the study, which was the Shaywitz screener. It was, in fact, significantly more accurate. The DIBELS Next was in assessing, identifying or predicting dyslexia. And when we think about what dyslexia is, they have problems with accurate or fluent recognition. They have problems with phonological components of language. If we just assess for that, that may be sufficient and most sufficient and efficient and effective. So we could just continue to use those universal benchmark screeners created to answer that question, who might need help, those assessments that are assessing phoneme awareness and word reading efficiency, assessments such as letter naming, letter sound fluency, nonsense word fluency, and text reading or oral reading fluency. We use those as universal screeners, and then with this goal in mind that we're doing assessing to figure out what we do for intervention, the next step of going toward a diagnostic skills assessment to answer the question, what help do they need? That might be our best bet in getting as quickly to the instruction. And when we do diagnostic skills instruction, this is what we should be assessing. Assessments, and there are wide varieties of assessments that can do these kind of deeper dive into the actual skills. As part of the handouts available to you today, I've included a PDF of this page from my book, Conquering Dyslexia, which is not the assessments itself, but a checklist that you could use. Just an overview of some of the assessments that probably should be included if we're doing some diagnosis of the skill level of students who may be dyslexic. Should include these things: phonological phonemic awareness, phonics and decoding, their sight word recognition, their reading fluency, etc. And then the chart or the checklist is a way for you to indicate in whatever standards that you've set up your opinion, or you might have some benchmarkers or standards to say, for this child, is phonemic awareness a concern, yes or no? Is the level of concern mild or moderate or severe? And if you do that for all of these areas, spelling and handwriting and language proficiency, is there some family history around dyslexia? Has appropriate instruction been available to the student? Because that's really important when we're considering dyslexia. If the student is showing severe challenges in many of these areas, but they have not received adequate instruction, we cannot use that to conclude that dyslexia might be the concern. But it is really important, all about those, that early screening, but not just for checklists and not just to say, yes, we think we have a student that it has dyslexia. As we've talked about before, it's all about the interventions. And we want to get started with that as soon as possible because of the good news we have that with early intervention, appropriate intervention, we can get almost all our students to high levels of success in reading. So how do we do that? How do we go about doing that? Well, researchers around the world, including Jennifer Buckingham and colleagues in Australia, have come to the same conclusion that I have and many other researchers, that let's worry less about which are the students who have dyslexia and which are not. And they say that the best thing, the most ethical and prudent thing for us to do as educators is to provide all children with the most effective reading, accelerating the process that all children have and minimizing the likelihood that any child will struggle in learning to read. And what is that? What is that magical instruction that's going to get them there? Well, when I look at the growing body of evidence around what's now these days often called as a shortcut, the science of reading, I see compelling evidence around these components. Some of them have been studied, in fact, for many decades. We really have some solid evidence around these components. We know that the best instruction is comprehensive, it's systematic, it's explicit, it's sufficiently intensive depending on the needs of the students. I've been thinking about Nancy Young's ladder, those children in the green and the dark green. The level of intensity of instruction that those students need is very non-intensive. A lot of those children learn through less explicit and more implicit learning. So the intensity increases as the needs of the students increase toward the bottom of the ladder. So intensity, and we have evidence about the value of multimodality, and that's also supported by research that says we do this best if we use data to inform our instruction. But of course, that's really a mouthful, isn't it? When we're trying to talk about effective instruction and we say it's comprehensive, systematic, explicit, intensive, multimodality, informed by data. So we use a shortcut, and you've probably heard this term, structured literacy, which describes these components, which we might call the what of learning. And structured literacy also helps us understand the process or the how of instruction as well. But let's go over these components. They are very important, and we want to be sure that we're sharing the same understanding of what they mean. So my interpretation of comprehensive instruction means that whatever we're using to teach children to read and write is designed to cover both those essential foundational components of reading, and we can go back to Scarborough's rote to look at what those are, and covering both decoding and encoding. And those are the foundational skills, but we don't stop there. There are some people who take a quick look or a quick listen to some of us who are talking about structured literacy and only hearing that it's about phonics, and objecting to that, saying we should not just be focusing on phonics and we should not just be teaching phonics. And they are absolutely right. We should not be doing that. So when we talk about instruction, we're talking about comprehensive. We must get those foundational skills right. We know that a lot of our students, including students with dyslexia, do struggle tremendously with phonics. So we need to get that right. But we want to make sure that we're teaching the advanced skills and that knowledge that is essential for comprehension. So when I say comprehensive instruction, that's what I'm meaning. Systematic, well, there are whole books written about systematic instruction, but briefly, I think of systematic instruction as one that has been carefully designed. And part of careful design means paying attention to both the scope and the sequence. What are we going to try to cover in a lesson, in a week, in a unit, in a year? What are we going to teach? And the sequence then is the order. It would be really smart for us to teach some of the easier to pronounce and easier to remember letter and sound sequences first before we get to the more difficult ones. It would be a good sequence to teach how to decode words before we are asking students to read text. So the design of the instruction, and for many of our students, especially those students who have dyslexia or other learning challenges, frequent reviews needs to be part of the design. One time through is going to be absolutely sufficient for some of our students, but it's not going to be anywhere near sufficient for many of our students, for many others of our students. So the systematic design. And then we know through, this is explicit instruction is one of those things where you can easily go back and find 50 years, going on 60 years now of good research about the delivery of systematic instruction, where the instruction that is delivered both with clarity and intention using a model of gradual release, the very famous from Anita Archer's work, the I do, where we show the student what it is we want them to do. We practice with them and give them feedback, the we do step, leading to the ultimate independent practice, the you do step. That's in a quick nutshell, the sense of explicit instruction. And then the level of intensity. How narrowly should we focus the practice? What is the purpose of the work that we do? Lots and lots of active engagement to keep our students, especially those who struggle with learning, and every step of it is hard. We want to be sure that they are actively engaged in seeing it and hearing it and saying it and writing it, which takes us right to this notion of multimodality. This term multimodality is being used these days more frequently than an older term of multisensory. The term multisensory has been around for well over 100 years, and it is being replaced in part because a lot of the things, the instructional practices that were included in what was then called multisensory have subsequently been found to be of less value. We just didn't have the good research abilities that we do now. So as we research aspects of instruction, find out what really works, we're leaving behind things like tracing sandpaper letters, air writing. Some of those things just haven't panned out in terms of value. But what has certainly shows strong value is having students engage all their sensory modalities in tasks that directly relate to reading and writing. So tracing, using a pen or a pencil or a piece of chalk or a pen on a whiteboard, seeing the letters, tracing the letters, writing the letters from memory, all of those kinds of things do have good evidence of being valuable to our students in learning, and doing all that as informed, making sure we're informed by data, and we figure out what those lessons should be from our data from the diagnostic skills assessment. And then we turn to progress monitoring to determine whether the work is working. And oftentimes, at least for our struggling readers, the progress monitoring can take the form of data that we graph along with a goal line or an aim line, that's the red line here, to see week by week whether our students are making progress or not. So if they are not, like the student here was not making good progress, and so we had to stop and make a change in the program, and then that was we have evidence that changed program is working. So another handout available to you if you would like is this little checklist, simply a way of listing some of the things we talked about today and being able to judge it. You can look at the work that you're doing, the curriculum materials, the instruction that you're providing or you and your colleagues are providing. Are you doing it really well? Are you doing it somewhat? Is this something that you could maybe work on a little bit? So that is the how or that is actually some of the processes that need to be in there. And then we talk about what we teach and when we teach it. What are we teaching comprehensively, systematically, explicitly? That can take us back to Scarborough's rope. What we need to teach for reading includes these aspects of language comprehension and word recognition to get us to that point of skilled reading. The word recognition being those components of phonological awareness, all those components, the decoding. And it's this area, the reason I've highlighted this area is because we are specifically thinking about our students with dyslexia, and it is this area of reading where our students have in general the most difficulty. There are many ways of talking about the development of reading, the trajectory of reading. We have the Aries phases of reading, Jean Charles stages of reading, and other theoretical descriptions of how reading develops over time or how it should develop over time. In 2015, Dave Kilpatrick came up with a nice, simple way of talking about early word identification, levels of development as readers develop the capacity to identify words. And it's just a nice, simple, straightforward way of thinking about this. He labeled the entry level, as what's going on there in the levels of development as students are learning their letter names and their letter sounds. He calls that level 1. Level 2 is where they're starting to put their knowledge of letter sounds together and actually learning the process of blending and segmenting for decoding and encoding. And he calls that that stage, or that level, is what's phonic decoding. And then what we're trying to reach, the reason we care about those earlier levels is because we want to help all of our students get to level 3, which Dave calls the orthographic mapping level, where if we've developed in the brain sufficient knowledge of letter names and letter sounds and how they link together, and the sequence that we can expect, and the meaning of those words, all of those components serve to help anchor that particular letter sequence in the word to the point where the brain now knows it permanently, unless there is some kind of after the fact brain injury that is permanently located in the brain and available for instantaneous retrieval, which is what the foundation of what we hope for fluent reading is all about. And we can take this right back to Scarborough's rope and think about those levels as mapped onto this rope. And I have heard Dr. Scarborough talk about her rope and say that when it was published in this form, as we're seeing it here, the form that probably most of you are familiar with, it was actually inaccurate, because what she had given to be published was this image with these labels, but it had an arrow across the bottom. And she said, the publisher took the arrow off the bottom, and she was disappointed in that, because she always meant it to be a developmental model, that you start here, and this is probably the area, the representation of what Dave Kilpatrick would call level 1. And it's what we hope happens for most of our readers in the kindergarten and early first grade level. They're strengthening their language comprehension, they're learning some print concepts, they're building their vocabulary, but the work is happening down here. They're learning about the phonemes, they're learning about the alphabetic principle, blending and decoding, sound symbol correspondence. They're beginning to orthographically map some words in their sight vocabulary. And then as we move along, the work in mid first grade to early second grade could be represented by this part of the rope, where they're doing all that work. It's the same work, but now the brain really is weaving those things together. And you see Scarborough's words of what's happening here is all of these processes are becoming increasingly strategic and increasingly automatic through practice. And we then get to, we hope for most students, this place of skilled reading, which most students will get there around somewhere in grade 2. We know that thinking about Nancy's ladder of reading, those kids in the dark green, some of them come into kindergarten already at this stage. But for our neurotypical, generally developing students, by about mid-second grade, we can be at that tightly woven rope, the level 3 of reading that Scarborough calls skilled reading, the fluent execution and coordination. But we also know in the real world that many of our students don't get to that tightly woven rope. They may spend many years, they may spend the rest of their life here. And this is very typical of our students who struggle with reading. Very few of the older students and adults who struggle with reading, very, very few of them are not able to read some words. They've learned a little bit about the alphabetic principle. They know some words, they know some decoding, they may have some sight words, but they get stuck at this area. And if we had been doing, if all of us learned how to do good analysis of where our students' skills are, learn about the best targeted interventions that we can do, we can prevent this from happening, or go back and do interventions that do move our students out of this area. So the final little handout for you that I've included today is this, the what of teaching not only dyslexia, of course, but all aspects of reading. But this is what was included in my book. We need to be sure, in order to develop strong readers, that they have language comprehension, they have well-developed phonological phoneme awareness, phonics, they have sight words. We work with them on reading passages and text fluently, and we do all the appropriate instruction across all of those levels. And this chart, again, is just for you to do some analysis, perhaps some discussion with your colleagues about what you're currently doing, and would you consider it strong, or is this an area where perhaps you need some more materials to use, you need perhaps some more professional development about how to work on that, just for that kind of analysis. So this whole session is really been devoted to our wish and our desire and our attempt to build readers who are as confident as possible. And just to summarize, the way we get there is through early identification, as early as we can possibly do it. And we do have some reasonably good tools to do that now quite early. We can use letter naming fluency, letter sound fluency, particularly in the earliest stages of reading development, to serve as an indicator of which students are going to find this process of building those neural circuits, which students are going to find that process quite easy and which are the ones who are going to struggle. But it's not just the assessment. We need that early identification plus early and appropriate intervention. And when we do that, and when we do it well, we can achieve what Sally Shaywitz has long talked about. We can overcome dyslexia. What Jack Fletcher talks about is if we do this early enough and accurately, well enough, we can prevent dyslexia. And as I mentioned before, that notion of preventing dyslexia, of course, we can't prevent a child being born with dyslexia. It is a biological, neurological brain anomaly. So you're not prevented, but you're prevented with good instruction, rewiring the brain so the student never has to deal with the negative challenges. And I would highly recommend searching for a little clip of Jack Fletcher on YouTube, and you can just search for his name, Jack Fletcher, and Preventing Dyslexia. It's a very short 2 minutes where he does a really nice job of describing what he means by preventing dyslexia. So if we do that early identification plus the as early as possible, appropriate intervention, we hope that we can help all of our students be confident and capable readers. So thank you so much for attending this session today or listening to a recording later. And Lizzie and I both thank you. I hope we do connect later. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hasbrouck, and to all of you for joining us. I have been following your questions in the chat and QA, and there's just so much interest and engagement, and people definitely want to hear more. So should be able to get at least a couple of those questions answered. One that came up a lot is where people can learn more about multimodal versus multisensory learning.
Yeah, that's one of the places I would start, and a good place to start with all things related to dyslexia, I think, is the International Dyslexia Association website. Now, if you become a member of IDA, International Dyslexia, they also have, you can possibly come to the annual conference, and they have various publications, but their website alone is a wealth of information. That's a good place to start, because that group IDA was did use the term multisensory for a number of years and have moved to using the term multimodality, and you can find some explanation there. I think there's also another website I often refer to people to is Reading Rockets, and I believe on Reading Rockets I've seen some discussion of the movement from multisensory to multimodality, and it's really not a huge shift in, but it's just it's one of the aspects of the science of reading. Science is not like, okay, here's what we know and we're done and let's go out and do it. Science is something that's always going on in the background and always changing, and there are people actively studying some of those techniques that were recommended for children with dyslexia, and through their research are just finding that they're not damaging, they're not wrong, but they're not as essential or perhaps as powerful as we once thought that they were.
That's a really great reminder as more and more people are learning about the science of reading, is that it is that body of research and study that continues to happen. It's not just a one and done kind of thing that you can implement. So
be a lot easier if it were.
Certainly. Wonderful. Thank you for that detail. We had a couple of I think there'll be quick questions. Someone asked if you could reshare the Nancy Young website, and then someone also asked if you could provide that detail again about the Spell Talk listserv.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, let me see. I might even, I'm still sharing the screen, right? I can go to, Nancy Young's, I'm glad people want to go there. That's very good. The website is her name. It's on here somewhere. Oh, yes. Kind of tiny letters, nancyyoung.ca. So, and I think if you go on any web browser and search Nancy Young Ladder, it will take you to her website. So yes, it's definitely, she's got a wealth of information there. And then the listserv, Spell Talk listserv, and I think I just quoted that from something that Steve Dykstra, yeah. So Spell Talk listserv, again, I don't, that's how I get there. If I miss my bookmark, just search for Spell Talk listserv, and they will, it will guide you to where you sign up for that work. So I'm glad people are interested in that.
Yeah, thank you so much for resharing that. We had a couple questions in the chat there. Let's see, you guys had so many wonderful questions. I'm trying to get to the ones that have the most love. Someone asked how early dyslexia can be detected. Can you provide a bit of detail there?
Yeah, well, I can tell you the one thing I know, and some of the work that I'm following is Dr. Nadine Gabb, who is now doing her work. She has a lab at Harvard University, and she is actually one of the people studying to help us answer that question. She is studying the brains of infants, because we do understand dyslexia to be inherited. It's a heritable trait. So when we have identified a family where many of the family members clearly have, especially if it's quite severe dyslexia, we can anticipate that children born into that family are likely to have those same neurological difficulties. So she is doing brain scans of infants and toddlers. And she talks a lot about the challenge of just doing that, because to have a brain scan, you have to be absolutely still. So she has people in her lab helping put these children to sleep and then doing brain scans. It's fascinating work. So we're still exploring how early we can actually identify. We don't yet have a blood test or a brain scan that we can do. So most people, I think, are generally saying somewhere probably around 4 or 5 years old, once children in general are starting to be aware of the print in their world. There's some aspects and some theories about language production that we can possibly see earlier in children, like when children are learning to say nursery rhymes and recognize, oh, these two words sound alike, they rhyme, that some children with dyslexia have difficulty doing that. It has to do with their brain's difficulty hearing and processing phonemes, that rhyming is difficult for them. So we might pick up patterns or difficulties in rhyming around 3 years old or so. But once we start with print, we can more readily see which students are going to be having difficulty when the rest of their life things have not been difficult, but connecting print to a sound is really difficult. And that starts to really rear its head around 4 or 5 years old.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you for that. And kind of on the flip side, someone said that they have students being diagnosed in middle school, and so they're wondering the best way to help them.
Yeah. How do we help our older students? Yeah, so this really goes to the heart of part of my message here today, is that there's very little that we need to do that's particularly different with kids with dyslexia. It's just kids who struggle. So if they've gotten to middle school, as a struggling reader, the cause of that being dyslexia or not being dyslexia, we really don't have any evidence that we need to treat those children differently. What needs to happen, however, is that we need, I'm obviously a very visual person, so I go back to that reading rope all the time. If a student's in middle school, that means that they are stuck in that middle part of Scarborough's rope. They are still trying to weave together the component pieces. And one of the unfortunate things is that they've now learned a lot of things incorrectly. So we have to kind of unwind aspects of the rope and take them back where we should have provided good, solid instruction at the earlier stages. So we do need to teach them to accurately decode words, but we cannot take them back to a kindergarten or first grade decodable text. So there are good materials that people have developed for doing that kind of rewinding, a redo for those older kids and giving them access to text that's more age appropriate. But the work is the same. They need to learn to accurately decode and encode words so that they can move on to the next level of reading.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. And we are coming up on time, so I'm so sorry we're not able to get to all of your questions, but we really appreciate you both being here with us today and being so engaged and interested. There was a lot of really lovely conversation in the chat as well. Great. Just want to remind you all that we are not done sharing out with you. We have a couple more webinars left in this series. If you go to amplify.com/literacy is, excuse me, I keep messing those up. literacy-is-opportunity-series. You'll see what we have left. Next week, we're talking to some middle school ELA teachers. And then in May, we're going to be learning about knowledge building in middle school and also the importance of language screening. So make sure to check those out, register to join us. And if you can't join live, we'll send you that recording afterward. Thank you all so much for joining us today. And a big, huge thanks to Dr. Hasbrouck. We really appreciate your insights and expertise, and all of you for taking the time on this late April day. We are so happy that you joined us. And just as a quick reminder, we're going to be sending out a follow-up email with the recording to this webinar and the presentation deck. So all those wonderful resources that we were sharing throughout, you'll have access to in just a few days. Thank you all so much. Take care.
Bye.